Hello and welcome to this Fane online event. My name is Daily Ward and I am so excited to be talking today to internationally renowned and loved poet and novelist and screenwriter Olivia Gatwood to speak about this darkly beautiful debut novel, Whoever You Are, Honey, which explores how women build themselves and are seen and built and torn down and projected upon. I'm so excited to be talking about this novel today. Hello, Olivia.
Hi, Ursa. Thank you for having me and talking to me.
Yes, how you doing? How you feeling today?
I'm feeling well. I haven't done a ton of this is one of my earlier events with my book, so it's still very fresh. I'm not sick of my own book yet, so I feel really good.
Thank you. I feel so, yeah, I feel so honored to be talking to you about it today. And I've got to tell you, this read it was so thrilling from the start to the end. And I think it's a masterpiece. And I can't wait for more people to know and understand the story. I've been talking about it to so many people, but not wanting to give anything away. So I saw the other day that you did this incredible reel in which you spoke about the themes surrounding this novel and that this novel is made up of. And if you don't mind, I would love to just read the short write-up for this novel because I think the lines that describe it are just so incredible. And so if you don't mind, I just want to read a little bit about it. So, whoever you are, honey. On the Santa Cruz waterfront, every house is as flawless as the people inside, except for Mitty and her elderly roommate, Bethel. For 10 years, Mitty has found refuge in their secluded existence after a traumatic adolescence. Now they're the oddball pair in the dilapidated bungalow. But their lives are about to be disrupted when a new couple, Lena and Sebastian, move in next door. Sebastian is a renowned tech founder, and Lena is his spellbinding girlfriend, seemingly floating through their luxurious life. But just like Mitty, Lena has her own secrets. She feels uneasy about her oddly spotty memory and is growing increasingly wary of the way Sebastian closely controls their lives together. After the two women begin to form close friendship, they are finally forced to face their pasts, or lack thereof, which have overpowered their lives for far too long, and the urgent truths that could change everything. Whoever You Are, Honey is gripping and seductive as it dissects relationships between women, unpacks perfection and desirability, and explodes the intersection of passion, technology, and power. When I read that, I thought it was just like the perfect like summary of what this book is about. And as I just read it then, I had lots of questions come to mind, but I'm going to try and stick to what I wanted my first question to be. And Olivia, you write so what I find so special and intricate about your work is how you take gripping themes, desirability, gendered violence, beauty and now Silicon Valley and make them whole and really so human and so complex. And I wanted to know why AI? Like why AI and why this time?
Well, what's funny is I'm actually not a tech person, like at all. Like I have an iPhone 7. Like it's on purpose, by the way. And I just don't like I don't keep up with new tech. I'm really not. It's not even that I'm necessarily against it. I just don't care, really, is what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and so it's not even the tech element of it that I think pulled me in, but I think I'm always looking at the world through the lens of gender politics. I think it's just the way my brain turns things, and I'm always curious about how if or how things are affecting the minds of women and women's relationships to each other, women's relationships to their bodies, women's relationships to beauty and desirability. And so I think everything sort of goes through that filter for me. And when I was living in Santa Cruz, the conversation around AI was pretty hard to escape. It was everywhere. You know,
Yeah.
I was dating someone who was in a friend group of almost entirely men who worked in tech. It was my first time socializing with men who worked in tech. And I really loved them. Like, they were charismatic, smart, really interesting men. And I learned so much about the behind the scenes of something that I was of an industry that I was interacting with every single day. So I was both kind of seeing how it unfolded in my world on social media, seeing how like filters were coming into the sort of world of Instagram, and watching how that affected people in my life, and then also watching these men who work in tech, many of whom, you know, had a real hand in some of these apps and creations, how they talked about it. And so the story came together both kind of at first pretty quickly, and then over time, it just constantly was changing because the landscape around AI was changing. And what started as sort of almost like a sci-fi conspiratorial story became more and more realistic as time went on. And so the story I found gradually actually became more human because it moved away from this like really obvious science fiction, um, uh, genre, and moved much more into like realism. So I think, what I'm really interested in at the end of the day are women's relationships to each other. And in this case, I think tech plays a role in that, because tech has the ability to both connect us and completely separate us. And it does both all the time. And so when we think about that through the gaze of women, what does that conversation look like? And so that's kind of where I started from.
I love that. And I see, iPhone 7, that's incredible. That's probably why you have time to write. And yeah, I notice I think that you use technology yourself in such an incredible way. And I remember over the pandemic when you were sort of building this mosaic of women in with the grayscale, and women in, I guess, in isolation, the Girls of Isolation
Yeah.
project. And I just think it's really special the way that you take something like, a selfie and turn it into almost a reckoning, a reckoning, and an invitation to maybe viewing in a different way. I always get the sense with your work, whether it's Life of the Party or New American Best Friend, that you are learning yourself as we read you in the piece of work. And I wonder, this maybe was going to be a question that came later, but it's coming up now. I wonder if there were any reckonings that happened inside of this novel, any realizations or any surprises that you
That's
came
a good
upon.
question. Yeah, no, there were some really big changes that happened while I was writing this, both personally in my own life, also, like I said before, in the world of tech and AI, and both affected the story greatly. So, I think I approached it, maybe with every fictional story, I approached it a little bit from a distance because I didn't quite know these characters yet. I was writing more from like a propulsive need to see this story through, but I didn't really know these people very intricately.
Yeah.
And as time went on, I got really attached to them. And, I went through drafts of the book that were first person because I wanted to be in Mitty's POV, and then ultimately realized that didn't quite work. Um, there were drafts with entirely different characters that
Wow.
it started to feel like, oh, this dynamic actually isn't that interesting. So I think there was a draft where Bethel wasn't even alive. She was a figment of the past. And I just loved her so much that I brought her forward. It was, there were so many parts of this story that both, it was almost like parts of it were demanding to be brought to the forefront that I over time had to really listen to and honor. Um, but I think ultimately the biggest reckoning was that I wasn't writing a story about AI. I was writing a story about humanity. And that in some cases, those two things can feel one and the same, but they aren't. They're actually really, really different. And it's really important that we remember that, that being
Uh,
face to face and in front of each other is hugely important when it comes to recovering from conflict, when it comes to intimacy, when it comes to understanding each other, when it comes to like removing projection and grappling with our own envy. It being two humans facing one another, two tangible people looking at each other, is so important. And so I think that was kind of the biggest thing. Is this, it started as a story about AI where there were people, and then it became a story about people where there were AI.
that's beautiful. I think that's why it's such a triumph, because I guess it converges, and it it's like it's so like it's like a prism. You see so many different faces, and but also their humanity. And I haven't read anything that references, and I mean it's early days with AI uh so far, but it's to read something that is so topical and so now, but in such a human way, it makes it a very visceral. And I didn't know that it was so broad spectrum with, oops, I'm losing my sunglasses. I didn't know that it was such, you write about things and you write your way into them and then discard so much. So I wanted to ask you, do you start the novel knowing where you want to get to, or is everything a surprise? Is it a surprise? Is it like an uncharted journey?
Well, this is my first novel, so I think there was a lot of trial and error with this.
Yeah.
I think part of what I think, any I imagine any novel goes through a significant number of drafts and changes, but this one especially, I think I was so used to writing poems where not only are they significantly shorter, so there's just very simply like less words to work
Yeah.
with. Um, but also I think poems often do feel intentionally like an act of discovery. You're asking questions, you're unsure of where something is going. You can even leave it in that ambiguity, and there's an understanding between you and the reader that there's some amount of interpretation that's going to be happening. And in a novel there's a lot more pressure to have it figured out, but I
Right.
don't think that way. So I think I approached it like a poet, and in some ways that was really fun and gave the language a certain texture, and in other ways, at least in terms of plot, I think it did make my job a little harder, because I don't think I knew the answers going in. I knew kind of what I wanted to write about. I didn't quite know my thesis. I didn't know what that meant for my characters. I did not know where it was going to end. Um, and as I begin working on new projects, I have a much stronger sense of what the arc will be, and that has been really helpful. Even
Yeah.
just thinking that I know, I assume it's going to change, but having a really structured outline in these new projects I'm doing has been very, very life-saving. um, but I didn't quite know that for this book, and that was fun in its own way. But I also think, you're tackling something pretty massive with a novel. You're really dealing with a lot of language, you're dealing with a lot of plot points, and so as best you can to kind of organize them, I think is important. And this book didn't really begin to feel organized until a little later down the line. So
I Something about it, even though it might take up a lot more time, I think it really worked, and it seemed to mimic what happens in life. Like you don't always know where it's going. But I read the poet in you with every line of the book. And maybe I'm biased, but I my favorite novelists are poets.
me too.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, just because of the sentences, and even even the way that you bring us in and you talk about the Santa Cruz, the waterfront. And then I remember this line about like the houses like the like gaps in I'm going to actually read it because I'm gonna destroy it. But like the line about the houses and the way that you brought us in, I was like, only a poet could bring us in that way. Only a poet would know how to do that. And I wanted to ask this question because I was lucky enough to sneak into your reading last week and just like see you at the hotel cafe and just be your brilliant self, which is just so real, but also such a you're such a show person. Like you're like a comic, you're like the poet rock star, right? It's so incredible to well, I didn't think it, I was on the front row, like just so but it was wonderful to see that. And to my left, there was somebody who, as you were reciting some of your poetry, knew the words and was just such a fan of you. And it gave me goosebumps because I was like, yeah, like the people that know you and love you have been with you for so long and they know your work like inside out. And as poets, it's easy, I think, to fall to you know your pocket and you know it and love it, and it's wonderful to come up with these succinct lines and verses, and we can identify with being poets and everything that brings. But so many of us hear that call for longer pieces of work and fiction or screenwriting. But it still takes a certain kind of confidence and bravery to answer that call. So I wondered when the call came to you, and did you answer it the first time? Has it always been there? How did you know you were going to go on to writing like long form and go on to writing a novel? And was this the first idea for a
Right.
novel?
Well, thank you for saying all that. That's so kind and generous. Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's a often a call for people. And some of that is like literally just like capitalism. Like people are like, we need you to write a YA novel because those make a lot of money, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm sure you've had those calls.
Oh, absolutely.
And I find it incredibly hard to answer those calls entirely from a place of, oh, I need to do this because it's the right next step. Like I freeze up. I don't feel creative. So it really is important to me to answer to that when I'm feeling personally motivated to do so. Um, but I had taken like really small stabs at it before. I had attempted to like think about a YA novel. I had never really fully had an idea for a novel that felt solid. But I was, of course, looking at it, like kind of looking at the genre and thinking what I went to school for fiction and I've written various short fiction in my life, but I'd never really pursued it publicly. Uh, but really, I don't think it's a coincidence that the book before this, Life of the Party, was really, really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And like vulnerable to a degree where I'm very proud of it. And sometimes I read it and I almost feel like a mother, like watching her daughter, like say something wildly inappropriate at a party. And I'm like, oh my God, don't say that. Like I've become almost sort of prudish in my age. And I'm like, why did I say all of that? But it's, I think part of being a poet is that a lot of your work is autobiographical. You're I'm sure I'm actually very curious to know how you relate to this. Putting yourself out there to a really extreme degree in a way that you at the time almost are numb to. Like you're like, well, of course I'm going to tell you all of this. Like this is my
Right.
story. And it isn't maybe until later that the aftershocks hit you and you're like, whoa, like what is my own, what is there left to say? I think I also began to feel like there were complicated questions I was having about people that I didn't feel totally free to explore in an autobiographical way.
Mm.
Um, or maybe didn't feel safe is the wrong word, but I was feeling like I wanted to work through it through a different identity, you know,
Yeah.
that was feeling safer to me. And I was feeling more confident in that idea and free, I guess. It felt liberating. So, yeah, I'm curious about your experience with that, about sort of writing all of these vulnerable things about your childhood and, um, you know, coming of age, and then, what that means later.
I almost feel quite lucky about the factors. I don't know if you get this as well, but when you write, you become like a vessel for it's you, of course, but you kind of let it go through. And I think my my hack for this is I kind of don't think about it and let it fall through.
Yeah.
And I am an Aquarius, so I'm very delayed anyway. So I've done the thing and then think about it a year later. But thank God, because I think were I writing from like an older or more experienced viewpoint, would I write in the same way? Probably not. Like I still use my Substack to write a lot of things as they occur to me and really fall through. But I think that there's a little more restraint now than in the days of writing Bone and The Terrible.
Yeah.
And I think so I read Bone now and I'm like,
Yeah. No, I mean, but I was reading it earlier today and was like, wow, this is so raw, and like beautiful and a gift, Yeah.
I think there's almost this younger self that has to do that, and I celebrate that, and perhaps it needed to come, and I wonder if you have this experience. Perhaps you needed to have this to get to the next phase, which is the novel. Perhaps there were things that needed to move gracefully out of the way, and it is it's a younger self, but also a self that needs to be celebrated and left there as well. And I think every time I get those moments, and I know you were saying this on stage, that sometimes there are poems where you're like, ooh,
Yeah.
but that they're almost not for us. They're when they meet the air, they become less about us anyway, and it's like I guess a mirror image of the person who reads it. So I always think it was supposed to do something. So I get out of the way of that whenever I feel tempted to be like, why did I write
I
that?
love that. No, I really love that. The idea of when they meet the air, they become something else. I think that's really, I wish that I had channeled that a little bit more in the last few years, but I think you're right. When I was looking through Life of the Party and New American Best Friend before this show and was thinking about what to read, I was reading it just feeling really proud of that young self. Like there's moments where you feel really exposed and embarrassed. And then, there's moments where you are like, wow, I would never write this today. I would never ever admit to this, or, say I would find a way, because I'm so aware of an audience now, I would find a way to explain it away and be like, no, actually, you can't say that, or don't go there, or whatever. There's something really beautiful about how brazen you are as a young person. And I think you're right. That does have to, for some of us, not everyone is this way, but I do think for writers, you do have to move through all of that in order to land in a different place,
For
and
sure.
yeah.
And just I said it before, but I'll reiterate again, the people that read your work and you just put words to things that are so specific and so universal. And so even when there is that maybe vulnerability hangover, it's kind of it was supposed to happen if for somebody else. I'm going to go back to this line. It was the beginning. I made reference to it before. The beachfront, the stretch of sparsely occupied beachfront properties lining Potbelly Beach Road resembles a row of gap teeth. And when I saw that line, that opening line, I was like, I'm going to love this. I'm going to love this book. But I want to ask you something that was really it it was a reckoning for me, and it hit me very strongly in reading your book was the gorgeous way in which you write about Mitty and Bethel's relationship and how they find refuge together. And it made me wonder about relationships with elders, which is something that I don't think we read a lot about in modern fiction, and something I don't see a lot in the TV shows that I watch. And it was such a special relationship. And I'd love to know where it came from, and the role of elders in your life, if you, or older women in your life, and what it was that, because I think it's such a special thing to write about, and what led you to have Bethel as this central character, as kind of a mirror and older figure for Mitty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting because I don't actually remember exactly how Bethel came to be in terms of deciding that she was going to be a figure in the novel, but I do know what she's based on. Um, I lived on Long Island for a few years, and I lived with my close friend Megan and her mom. Well, Megan and I were on tour, and we rented her, rooms at her mom's house on Long Island for very, very cheap while we were basically touring for most of the month. And eventually Megan moved in with her partner across the country, and I stayed. And so it was just me and Megan's mom, whose name is Annie. And I sort of, became like a part of Annie's social group. Annie was a yoga teacher. And so she, taught yoga to all these older women. And I would kind of go and they'd sort of be like, who's this girl? Like, where are her parents? Um, and, when I was having issues in my relationships, like Annie was the one I turned to, so there was all of the kind of advice. And I worked as a cater waitress with a number of Long Island women, and all of the advice and insight I was getting about love and identity and womanhood at that time were from women that were, 40 years older than me. And it was deeply formative. It was like, I too felt that way of, wow, I haven't had this relationship very ever in my life, and I don't see it very often. And it was, what I found to be the most helpful about it was that I was talking to people who had this vantage point that was, on one hand, could be seen as jaded, almost like, oh God, you're like crying over that boy again, but was so, so refreshing to feel like, oh, there is a future where I don't feel this way. Like there is, I felt, it made me feel so hopeful. Um, and I really missed it when I was gone. And so I wanted to channel that. And then Bethel really started to take shape as a person when I found myself holding all of these little wisdoms that I'd collected, mostly from my mom throughout my life. And I wanted to channel those wisdoms through a person. And so Bethel is kind of an amalgamation of my mom, my grandma, who I actually didn't know, but I hear about through my mom. And then my mom's close friend growing up, who was this woman named Kay. And she was the first woman I'd ever met that had no care truly at all about the way she looked. Like this woman
Wow.
did not care at all. I mean, she was like complete. And because of that, and this is, I care about the way I look. This is not to put down like any woman that is any way preoccupied with beauty, because Kay also had downfalls, or maybe sort of like a lot of internalized misogyny around women who cared about beauty. But it was eye-opening to see that, and to the point where like she once saw me playing with Barbies, and she was like disturbed that that I hadn't yet mutilated my Barbies. Like she was like, why are you keeping them so pretty? Like you should be drawing on them and twisting them around. Like, what kind of girl are you? She like wanted me to destroy beauty. And, because she wasn't preoccupied with beauty, she also was like hilarious, incredibly funny, like really, really brave, didn't give a shit about what men thought of her. And I just like, it was infectious as a young girl. And but then at the same time, Kay had rejected so much in her life that she was also deeply reclusive, and she hated a lot of things. and she struggled to be around people. And ultimately, her and my mom lost touch. And then a couple years ago, my mom went kind of looking for her again, and it turned out that she had died of an illness, and that her body had gone unclaimed for 3 years, and so she was buried in an unmarked grave for people with no family. So Kay really did like die a recluse. You know, she died alone, and no one claimed her body, which is like a profound sense of being alone that I can't fathom. And so, like I said, Kay was a complex person. She was hard to be around. She was oftentimes bitter, but she was like hilarious and wise. And I just wanted to channel that duality in someone. And I wanted to watch as a young woman navigated that,
Yeah.
the element of it that's liberating and the element of it that's suffocating. Uh, and so I think Bethel's largely based on Kay, but I also think Bethel is she's kind of the most mesh of people that I know of anyone in the book. So
I see so much of that in Bethel, everything that you just mentioned, so much of that. And also the complexity of a human and the complexity of women is something that is in every character, in whoever you are, honey. I see that the almost the tension. And I wanted to ask about, because you touch on themes, you touch on body mutilation, you touch on body horror. There's some elements of that, which I thought was so dark, interesting. And how were you able, because it's such a complex subject, especially as a writer, as a poet, as somebody who is supposed to comment on these things as though separate from these things, but also not, because you're very visible. How were you able to interrogate your own changing views and ideas on beauty and why you exist, and
mm-hmm.
in your world and in the novel?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting with the novel because you sort of, in the same way you were saying with poetry, how you kind of have to step out of the way and let a poem live. You sort of have to do that with your characters in the book too. You sort of have to step out of the way. You want the book to reflect your own ideas, but you're not, your characters are not you. Like they are your characters. I don't agree with everything that Bethel says.
Yeah.
I certainly don't agree with everything Mitty says or thinks or feels. Um, and so you kind of have to, I think, both let your characters be maybe regressive or not reflect things you're feeling, while also somehow maintaining the kind of like pathos of the book should still be true to you as a person. And I think that's a really delicate balance. And maybe ultimately what that's about um, is maybe it's like pushing your arc to be reflective of those ideologies, but allowing your characters to be flawed within that arc.
Yeah.
And so I think, but I did a lot of grappling. I mean, there was a lot of parts of this book that I would go back and be like, actually, that either that doesn't feel true to this character, or that feels like wrong enough to me that I actually don't want it to be here. But you do sort of have to get out of the way. I feel like when I'm reading a book where I can sense that the writer is either afraid or is really wanting all their characters to be super likable and like epically perfect. I can feel that. And it doesn't feel
Yeah.
real.
It shows, yeah, the pulling back.
It really
Oh,
shows. Yeah.
yeah, I love a place to put my shadow self. Like
Yeah, that's what it
I
is,
love to
right?
get gritty and terrible with it. It's like this is where you can behave in the way that, like, in kind of like, and some of the base desires, or just the shadow self, or the other self you might have been, gets to come
Yeah.
up into the work, and it's a great it's a great exploration.
Well, and I was talking to my friend last night and he was telling me about some anxieties he's having. And I said to him, like, what if you just sort of pretended you were like a lifeguard at a pool and you're watching all these people in the pool play, and you're
Mm.
just watching them. Like, imagine those people are just your feelings. You're just like watching them. Like, no one is drowning. You don't have to jump in and deal with anything. You're just watching them. You're going, oh, that's an interesting feeling that's happening right there. Oh, that's there too. Like, oh, there you are. You don't have to do anything about it. And I feel like some of a novel is actually seeing what shows up, and maybe the ones that are the most uncomfortable, you don't dive in and try to save it. In fact, you like let it scramble and you go, oh, okay, what would happen if that little feeling that's coming up for me, what would happen if I actually really entertained that and like went for it? And who would that be? So with Mitty, it's like all of her feelings around like all of her internalized misogyny, those are things I have felt, but
Mm.
I didn't entertain them. I didn't act on them. I didn't even necessarily think through them as far as she does. But noticing that in me and being like, oh, I have felt that towards women before. Now, what would happen if I was just a little more unhinged? Like that's I think how you start building a character, and eventually that character isn't you anymore. It's totally someone else, you know.
That's
Um,
that's true.
but it's
Especially
fun and cathartic and interesting to do.
absolutely. And when I think of like Mitty's backstory and just what took her there, which we find out later in the novel, it's a real turning point. And yeah, I wonder about that, whether sort of heartbreak or unrequited stuff is just this rites of passage we have to go through to uncover some of those deeper, maybe conditioning, like
Yeah.
feelings of ownership that come up. And I think that's a perfect analogy, the analogy of just watching these things happen. A bit like playing The Sims, like what would
Yeah.
happen if they just go and do what they do?
Right. Or taking an experience, like you said, like a heartbreak or unrequited love, something all of us feel. And maybe a story that is worth writing is one where you take a feeling that we've all felt, but then you see it all the way through. Like, what if this thing that most of us just feel and then we move on from, what if instead something horrific happened during it and it imprinted on your life, or it doesn't even have to be horrific, but what if that small thing we all feel suddenly is expanded in a person's life to where it dictates so much of who they are? Like, those are, I think, the stories that people find themselves in, and then they also get to imagine. Like, it's both, and so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that that's sort of a fun way to work things out, I guess.
It really is. And a lot must have been worked out by writing this novel. The difference from when you start with your very first spark of an idea to when you're writing the end, which is, it's such a journey. And by the way, I love the Say More podcast. I love it. It's awesome. And I don't remember when it was, but there was an episode, and the title of it was, Do we even like writing? This is a question I ask myself every day, like, why the hell did I ever think writing was a good idea? Doing this for my like way of life. And I wanted to ask you that question. Is it something that you feel you have to do? Or is it something that you want to do? And do you like it more days than you don't? Or are there days when you don't like it?
I try to write most days, and I go through periods of focusing more heavily on certain projects.
Mm.
So, I'll go through a couple months of writing almost every day, working on like my next novel. But then I'll sort of pull back from it and I'll start working on a screenplay and have more focus on that. And I'll do these kind of chunks. They're not super organized, but they're a little organized. I do try to make myself write because I think waiting for inspiration is pretty unreliable. And as this is a job. Like, you have to show up to work. When this
Yeah.
is your income, like, you really do have to just go do it. Um, so I write best in the mornings. I write best in silence. I write. I am a little bit neurotic about distraction. Like, sometimes I'll feel like if someone calls me at like 8:30 a.m., like, even if it's something minor, like I have to confirm a dentist appointment, I feel like oh, that like threw me off. And now I like need to get back. I have to like need another hour. I can be a little neurotic about it, but I'm not a person that like sits down and writes for this amount of time every single day. My life just doesn't allow that. Like I have a little dog like that has to do things. Like I have a partner. Like I just there's things in your life, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So and sometimes you just don't want to. Like sometimes a friend is in town and you like want to go have a beer with them in the middle of the day. And it's like I will do that. Um but yeah, but I do try to write something every day because otherwise I feel genuinely like I skipped out on work or something and I just feel guilty.
It sounds like you've got the balance right there. I'm always saying to myself, and maybe this is a procrastination thing, I'm like, well, I have to live,
Well,
life.
but that's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
yeah. And there is absolutely no, Olivia, there's absolutely no way I could sit down and say that I'm going to write for this amount every day. It's like this. Mine is like this. It's every day, but there's no set time. It could be like this or it could be like this. But,
Mm-hmm.
I like
And
the peaks and troughs of it.
yeah, I mean, but that's part of like, that is part of building a writing process is like understanding yourself also, like understanding your energy levels,
Yeah,
and that's a beautiful privilege of like being a full-time artist is you get to do that. But because there's this idea that you work from 9 to 5 every day, I think that we've all forgotten that like actually that's deeply unnatural, like
yeah.
having to do, and that's also not, that's based on something that has very little to do with like people's individual bodies and energy and so I think it's actually super important to just like listen to yourself, otherwise you're gonna just be miserable and I think you know
And
not
uninspired.
uninspired totally. Yeah.
And also, I see us, and I don't know if this is if you agree with this, but we're like mini recorders as writers. You have to be out in the field recording, doing your field recordings, whether it's the trees, whether it's the birds, whether it's seeing this argument happen across the street. Where you're taking things in all the time that we then probably keep in our hearts and our minds for years, and it makes its way into a story like months or weeks or years later. And with that, I've got to ask this because I'm so excited. I may have, when I was doing my little bits of research, got wind that you might be penning the screenplay. And
Yeah.
I mean, speak about it as much or as little as you want to, because I know that, I know that sometimes it's hush hush. But is there anything you want to say about that? Because I was so excited when I heard.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, so the production company called Lucky Chap, which is Margot Robbie's company, they optioned the book, and I've we've kind of been in each other's orbits for a while now, and they were just incredibly kind about the book and excited about it, and it was in this case important to me that I be the one to adapt it. I don't know that I'll always feel that way, but for this book in particular, I just felt like I want to do it. I can do it, and it was important to me that I worked with a production company that honored that. And so, yeah, the book's always been really cinematic to me. I feel like I can really clearly see it how it would be on screen. I didn't write it to be adapted, but I did write it as a person that loves film, so it's there. And yeah, so I'll be adapting it, which is both very intimidating and also I feel like the right person for the job. So it's kind of both.
The only person for the job. I'm telling you, those opening, I was seeing the credits and the beach and everything and all of the glass, the glass fronted buildings. I just think it's so cinematic and I can't wait. And I think you'll do an incredible job. I think it's the job is yours. Like I think I can't wait to see that in materialize. But thank you for writing such an incredible book and something that's so unflinching in so many ways. I just want to say thank you. And I'm gonna end because I could keep you here for 2 more hours. I don't think they'll let me do that. I want to end because we're talking about poet novelists and novelists. I want to know, uh, and I'll say that because this is it's probably such a big answer. So I'd like to know, in recent times, like the past couple of years, which writers have really moved you, as you move into fiction, which writers just made you want to expand this practice into longer form? Is there anybody that whose work just gets you recent years?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I think I agree that some of my favorite novels are written by poets, or and even beyond that, that there are just novels that you feel like a, they were written from a poet's brain. You know, you're like, a brain I understand. Like I understand why this person looked at this image and saw what they saw. Like I get it. You know, it's almost like a version of kind of like Georgia O'Keeffe's relationship to color. And you're like, oh, I understand why she painted that flower as bright blue, even though it's white. Like I get it. I feel the blue. So anyway, I think the first, you know, one of the first novels I think I ever read where I was like, wow, this is doing something with language and story that I want to do, or that I didn't know could be done, was The Bluest Eye. I just was like, by Toni Morrison, I was just like, this is this how stories should be told with this kind of unflinching, like you said, deep empathy, understanding of character, and also just textural and like sensual and uncomfortable, and it's just I think she is actually the greatest of all time. um you know, in recent years, I've been a fan for, you know, of Emma Cline since I read The Girls. I think Emma Cline's work is incredibly poetic. Her sentences are on another level to me, just individually her sentences. Um, I was really moved by Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. I thought that was like just an exceptional portrait. Um, We the Animals by Justin Torres is another book that when I read it, I was like, this is a poem. And I didn't know fiction could be a poem, you know? So, yeah, those are to name a few, you know, but, I think I've always been a fan of stories that don't need an answer, you know, they don't need, and I know there's ambiguity in my book, and I know that frustrates some readers, but I think I've always just loved stories where the writer trusts you enough to not give you all the answers, and instead, like, it kind of gives you everything else, you know, gives you um the texture of the world, and the emotional landscapes of the people inside of it, and that's kind of all I want from a story. So
And it kind of keeps the story alive in your heart.
yeah.
It twists and turns in your mind well after you close the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what your book does. And I just think it is stunning. Thank you. Thank you so much. But please, everybody, pre-order this book and pre-order it from your bookstore that's independent, but
Yeah.
pre-order it. Pre-order it. And it is out in the UK on the 11th of July.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you know when it's out in the US?
It's out in the US on July 9th. So yeah.
Yes, it will be out. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Olivia, for being here and answering my jumbled questions. This has been
No, those were beautiful questions. Thank you
oh,
for
thank
asking.
you. It's been such a pleasure and an honor. Thank you to Fane online. And yes, see you soon. Pre-order whoever you are, honey. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.